What if the giants from ancient texts never truly disappeared? The Nephilim are described as powerful, mysterious beings that existed before the Great Flood. According to some theories, the flood was meant to wipe them out completely. But what if it didn't? Some researchers believe traces of the Nephilim bloodline may have survived, hidden within human history, ancient civilizations, and even royal lineages. Stories of giants appear across cultures worldwide, raising one unsettling question. Did the Nephilim really vanish, or has their DNA been quietly passed down through generations? In this video, we explore the mystery of the Nephilim bloodline and the theory that giants may still be part of our world today. There is a story older than every civilization we have yet found, older than the pyramids and the ziggurats and the carved stone temples of Göbekli Tepe. It is a story that has been told across thousands of years and across every inhabited continent on Earth. It is told in the oldest religious texts of Mesopotamia, in the fragments of pre-flood mythology preserved by Sumerian scribes, in the Dead Sea Scrolls sealed in clay jars and hidden in desert caves for 2,000 years, in the oral traditions of Native American tribes, in the legends of the Inca and the Maya, in the mythology of ancient Greece and Persia and Egypt and India. It is a story about a time when the world was different, when the boundaries between the divine and the human were not yet firm, when something extraordinary walked the earth alongside ordinary men and women, something taller and stronger and older than anything that has walked since. And it is a story that does not end cleanly, because the thing at the heart of it, that ancient inheritance, that strand of something non-human woven into the fabric of human genetics, did not simply disappear when the floodwaters rose. According to the texts, according to the bones, according to the evidence that has been accumulating in archaeological digs and genetic laboratories for the past 100 years, it survived. We need to begin at the beginning, which means we need to begin in the deep past, in a period of history that most academic curricula simply skip over, a period sometimes called the antediluvian era, the time before the flood. Most people are familiar with the flood story in the broadest sense: the ark, the animals, the 40 days of rain, the dove with the olive branch. But that story, the version preserved in Genesis, is only one iteration of a much older, much more detailed account. And the older versions, the ones that predate the Hebrew Bible by 1,000 years or more, tell a considerably stranger and more disturbing story about what the world was like before the water came and why the water had to come at all. The oldest written flood narrative we have recovered is not from the Bible. It is from ancient Sumer, from the civilization that occupied the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq, and it is inscribed on clay tablets that archaeologists have dated to at least 2000 BCE, with the oral tradition behind it almost certainly stretching back thousands of years further. The Sumerian king list, one of the most remarkable documents in ancient history, records the names of kings who ruled before the flood and assigns them reigns of extraordinary length, tens of thousands of years in some cases. This has traditionally been dismissed as mythological exaggeration, symbolic rather than literal, but the document itself treats these pre-flood rulers with the same bureaucratic matter-of-factness as it treats the post-flood kings, whose dates we can actually verify archaeologically. The ancient scribes who compiled this list did not seem to think they were writing mythology, they seemed to think they were writing history. Among the pre-flood rulers listed in various Sumerian and Akkadian sources are beings described not simply as extraordinary humans, but as something other, the offspring of unions between the divine beings called the Anunnaki and mortal women. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains what may be the earliest literary version of the flood story, and which predates the book of Genesis by at least 1,000 years, opens with a description of Gilgamesh himself as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a hybrid being of extraordinary size and strength, who is explicitly described as having knowledge of the time before the flood because he was there, because he survived it. Gilgamesh is not presented as a mythological figure in the way that, say, Zeus is presented in Greek mythology, as a being from another realm entirely. He is presented as a historical king, a ruler of the actual city of Uruk, whose walls and whose tomb archaeologists have in fact found. The distinction matters enormously. The ancient Sumerians were not simply telling stories about the gods, they were recording what they believed to be actual history about actual beings who actually lived among them. The Hebrew Bible, drawing on and transforming these older traditions, introduces the Nephilim in a passage of remarkable brevity and remarkable density in the 6th chapter of Genesis. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years." The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. 6 verses. That is all that the canonical text of Genesis devotes to one of the most theologically and historically explosive passages in the entire Bible. 6 verses, and then the narrative moves directly into the story of Noah, as if what has just been described is simply the background context for what comes next. But those 6 verses, read carefully, contain several layers of information that reward close examination. First, the term Nephilim itself. In Hebrew, the word derives from the root naphal, meaning to fall. And the most common translation is fallen ones, though it has also been rendered as giants, as those who cause others to fall, and in older Latin translations simply as giants. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that was the standard version used in the early Christian world, translates Nephilim as gigantes, literally earthborn, though in common usage the word had already come to mean giants in the sense of enormously large beings. The distinction between fallen ones and giants is not trivial. It points to 2 different possible interpretations of who these beings were. Were they the offspring of fallen divine beings, the sons of God who had transgressed their proper boundaries? Or were they simply beings of great physical stature, gigantic humans rather than human divine hybrids? The answer, based on everything we know about how the ancient world understood this passage, is both. The traditions consistently describe the Nephilim as physically enormous, as hybrids of divine and human parentage, and as the source of both the knowledge and the violence that filled the pre-flood world with corruption. These are not separate traditions being awkwardly combined. They are consistently interwoven aspects of a single coherent mythology that the ancient world treated as historical fact. Before we go further into the book of Enoch, it is worth pausing on the identity of the sons of God in Genesis 6. Because the interpretation of this term is itself a significant question in biblical scholarship, and because getting it right is essential to understanding the full weight of what the passage is claiming. There are 3 main interpretive traditions. The first, dominant in modern evangelical Christianity, is the so-called Sethite interpretation, which holds that the sons of God were the godly descendants of Seth, the 3rd son of Adam, who intermarried with the ungodly descendants of Cain, the daughters of men, with the moral mixture producing the corruption that necessitated the flood. This interpretation has the advantage of avoiding any claim that supernatural beings had sexual relations with human women, which many interpreters find theologically problematic, but it has serious textual problems. The word used in Genesis 6, Ben Elohim, sons of God, is used consistently throughout the Hebrew Bible to refer to divine beings, to members of the divine council, to beings of a different order from humanity. It is used in Job chapters 1 and 2 to describe the beings who present themselves before God, including the adversary figure who challenges God regarding Job's righteousness. It is used in Psalm 82 in a passage where God pronounces judgment on divine beings who have abused their authority. It is used in Deuteronomy chapter 32 in the Dead Sea Scrolls version of the text, which reads, "When the Most High divided the nations, according to the number of the sons of God, assigning each nation its own divine being," a passage whose significance we will return to. In none of these cases does Bene Elohim mean simply morally upright human beings. It consistently means members of the divine council, beings who belong to the category of Elohim rather than the category of humanity. The Sethite interpretation, whatever its theological convenience, does not fit the linguistic evidence. The second interpretive tradition, which was universal in Judaism and Christianity until roughly the 3rd century CE, is the Watcher interpretation, the one preserved in the Book of Enoch, which reads the sons of God as divine beings, members of the heavenly council, who transgressed the boundary between the divine and human realms by taking human wives. This interpretation is confirmed by multiple lines of evidence, including the testimony of the earliest Jewish commentators on the text, the consistent reading of the Septuagint, and the explicit discussion of this interpretation in multiple New Testament texts, including 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 6, which refer directly to angels who sinned and to spirits who did not keep their proper domain, using language that is directly drawn from the Book of Enoch's description of the Watcher transgression. The third interpretive tradition, which emerged in Rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the Temple, and in certain strands of Christian interpretation in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, is the royal interpretation, which holds that the sons of God were powerful human kings who took multiple wives from among the general population, combining the Watcher interpretation with a more naturalistic reading of the text. This interpretation is a transitional position between the original supernatural reading and the later Sethite de-supernaturalization, and it preserves some of the original force of the text while making the physical details less cosmologically significant. For our purposes, the Watcher interpretation is not just theologically significant, it is scientifically interesting because it is the interpretation that most directly implies a biological event, a genetic mixing between two distinct populations, one of which is described as having physical and perhaps genetic characteristics dramatically different from ordinary humanity. If the sons of God in Genesis 6 are divine beings who introduce non-human genetic material into the human population, then the Nephilim are literally hybrids, the biological offspring of a cross between two different orders of being, and their descendants carry a distinctive genetic inheritance that can be traced through subsequent generations. This is not a metaphor, it is a specific biological claim made in the language of ancient narrative rather than the language of molecular biology, but a biological claim nonetheless. The Book of Enoch, which was a canonical text for the early Christian church and remains canonical for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church today, and which was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, confirming that it was read and valued by the Jewish communities of the Second Temple period, expands the 6 verses of Genesis into one of the most extraordinary documents in the ancient world. According to 1 Enoch, the sons of God who descended to earth and took human wives were not simply acting on impulse or desire. They were a specific group among the divine beings, numbering 200, who took a deliberate collective oath to carry out their transgression together. The text names their leader as Semjaza, and it names 18 other leaders, each commanding a group of 10, so that the 200 are organized into a hierarchy. They descended to earth on a specific mountain, identified as Mount Hermon in the text, a real and identifiable geographic location in what is now northern Israel, near the border with Lebanon and Syria. The choice of Mount Hermon is significant on multiple levels. The name Hermon in Hebrew derives from a root related to the concept of a sacred oath or dedication, cherem, which is the same root used in the concept of putting something under a divine ban. The mountain was already a sacred site in Canaanite religion long before the Hebrew scriptures were compiled. It sits at the intersection of what were, in antiquity, the territories of 3 major civilizational zones, and it is close to some of the most important archaeological sites in the ancient Near East. The Book of Enoch is saying, in effect, that the transgression of the Watchers happened in a real place that you could walk to. It is insisting on the historical and geographical specificity of its account. The Watchers, as 1 Enoch calls the 200 descending divine beings, brought with them several categories of knowledge that they transmitted to humanity. Azazel taught men to make weapons of war, swords and shields and armor, and taught women the arts of personal adornment, jewelry and cosmetics, and the dyeing of fabrics. Semjaza and the others taught enchantments and the cutting of roots, astrology and astronomy, the knowledge of cloud formations and meteorology, the properties of metals and the working of the earth. This knowledge is uniformly presented in the text as corrupting, as the source of the violence and sin that led to the flood. but it is worth pausing to recognize what is actually being described here. The Watchers did not bring humanity magic in the sense of supernatural tricks with no real-world correlate. They brought metallurgy, astronomy, agriculture, and military technology. These are precisely the technologies that define the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to civilized ones. The Book of Enoch is, in effect, providing an alternative account of the origin of civilization itself, attributing it not to gradual human development, but to the intervention of non-human beings. The children born from the unions between the Watchers and human women are described in Enoch in terms that have no parallel in any other ancient description of human beings. And the women became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells. 3,000 ells is obviously a symbolic or stylized number rather than a literal measurement, but the text goes on to describe what these giants did when they could no longer be fed by normal human agriculture. They turned first to consuming everything that human beings had produced, then to consuming the humans themselves, and then to consuming each other, and then to consuming the blood of animals and mixing it with flesh in ways that violated the natural order. The violence and corruption described here is total. It is the complete breakdown of every boundary that makes civilization possible. It is also, in the language of the text, the reason for the flood. God does not send the flood in Enoch simply because humanity is sinful in a vague moral sense. He sends it because the world has been physically and genetically contaminated by the intrusion of a non-human bloodline, because the Nephilim have so thoroughly disrupted the original order of creation that the only remedy is to wash the earth clean and start again. This is a crucial point that gets lost in the short Genesis account, but which is explicit in 1 Enoch and in several other related texts. The flood is not primarily a moral judgment. It is a biological reset. It is an attempt to eliminate a specific genetic contamination from the human population. And this is precisely where the story becomes most interesting and most uncomfortable, because the same sources that describe the flood as the intended elimination of the Nephilim bloodline also make clear that the elimination was not complete. The Nephilim survived. Not the original generation, perhaps, but the bloodline itself persisted, threading through the human population into the post-flood world. And the evidence for this persistence appears not just in mythology, but in archaeology, in anthropology, and increasingly in genetics. To understand how the Nephilim bloodline could have survived the flood, we need to understand more clearly what the ancient sources say about the nature of that bloodline and how it was transmitted. The consistent picture across all the major sources is that the Nephilim were not a simple first-generation phenomenon. The children of the Watchers and human women were the first generation of giants, but those giants themselves reproduced with human women, creating a second generation with a somewhat diluted but still active non-human inheritance. And those second-generation beings reproduced further, creating a third generation and a fourth, with each generation somewhat more human in appearance and somewhat less in the extreme physical characteristics of the original Nephilim, but retaining certain qualities, certain markers of that original non-human bloodline that made them recognizably different from ordinary human beings. This genetic model, extrapolated from the ancient texts, has a biological logic to it that is worth examining. If we understand the Watcher genetic material as dominant in certain traits, producing the characteristic gigantism and the extraordinary physical capabilities of the first-generation Nephilim, then in subsequent generations of interbreeding with humans, those dominant traits would express themselves less consistently and less dramatically, but they would not disappear. They would persist at lower levels of expression in the general population, surfacing in certain individuals and certain family lines with more intensity than in others, producing people who were noticeably larger or stronger or physically different from their contemporaries, without necessarily reaching the extreme heights and capabilities of the original Nephilim. This is exactly the pattern we see in the post-flood biblical narrative, where we encounter a series of giant races and individual giants who appear across centuries of Near Eastern history, always described as distinct from ordinary humans, always described in terms that echo the language used for the original pre-flood Nephilim. But before we get to the post-flood world, we need to spend more time in the pre-flood one, because the picture painted by the ancient sources of the antediluvian world is far more complex and far more specific than a simple story of giants and angels. It is a picture of a world that had, by the time of the flood, undergone a profound and thoroughgoing genetic and cultural transformation at the hands of the Watchers and their offspring, a transformation so complete that the God of the ancient texts found it necessary not just to destroy the world, but to preserve, in the person of Noah, a specific genetic lineage that had remained uncontaminated. The description of Noah in the Genesis text and in its elaborations in the Book of Enoch and other Second Temple Jewish texts is notable for its emphasis on genetic purity. Noah is described as righteous and blameless, but the text is also explicit that what made him suitable for preservation was something about his physical nature, his tamim, a Hebrew word that in other contexts means physically without blemish, perfect in form, the same word used to describe animals suitable for sacrifice. The Book of Enoch's description of Noah at his birth is even more explicit. In a passage that has been enormously controversial in scholarship, Noah is described at birth as so unusual in his appearance that his father Lamech, seeing him, is terrified and runs to the patriarch Methuselah to ask whether the child is truly his. The infant Noah has white hair, and when he opens his eyes, the house was lit up as bright as the sun, and the midwives present are terrified. Methuselah goes to his own father, Enoch himself, to ask what has happened, and Enoch tells him that Noah's unusual appearance is a sign that he will survive the flood that is coming to cleanse the world of the Nephilim corruption. This passage, found in the fragments of Wurt's Enoch discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls and known as the Book of Noah, or the Genesis Apocryphon, has been interpreted by some scholars as suggesting that Noah himself had some connection to the Watcher bloodline, that his unusual appearance at birth marked him not as purely human in the conventional sense, but as a different kind of being, one that could survive the flood precisely because he was already something other than the ordinary humanity that needed to be destroyed. This interpretation is highly controversial and is not the mainstream scholarly reading of the text, but it is worth noting because it speaks to the deep ambiguity at the heart of the Nephilim tradition, the uncertainty about where exactly the boundary lies between human and non-human, and the possibility that the distinction was never as clean as the text appears to assume. What is clear from both the canonical and the extra-canonical sources is that the world before the flood was understood by the ancient authors as a world in which humanity had been thoroughly mixed with a non-human genetic and spiritual element, in which the original human lineage had been so contaminated and the original human social order so disrupted that a global catastrophe was the only way to restore any semblance of the original order. And what is equally clear is that the ancient authors believed, and the post-flood narrative of the Bible confirms, that this contamination was not fully eliminated by the flood. Something survived, something was carried through the waters in the biological inheritance of the human beings who came off the ark, and that something eventually manifested again in the peoples and the individuals who inhabited the post-flood world, in the giant races of Canaan and Transjordan and Philistia, in the six-fingered, six-toed warriors described in the books of Samuel and Chronicles, in the terrifying inhabitants of Hebron and Gaza and Gath who made the Israelite spies feel like grasshoppers and who kept appearing in the historical record of the ancient Near East long after the flood was supposed to have washed their ancestors from the face of the earth. To understand how this was possible, we need to understand what the flood itself actually was, what the ancient sources say it was meant to accomplish, and how something as fundamental as a genetic lineage could have survived even a global catastrophic event. And to understand that, we need to look at the flood not just through the lens of Genesis and Enoch, but through the considerably wider lens of the comparative flood traditions of the ancient world, which together paint a picture of an event that was both more specific and more purposeful than the version most people know. The flood traditions of the ancient world number in the hundreds. Scholars have identified more than 200 distinct cultural traditions that include a global flood narrative from Mesopotamia to Greece, from Mesoamerica to the South Pacific, from sub-Saharan Africa to the indigenous peoples of North America. The sheer universality of this tradition is itself a remarkable fact that demands explanation. The conventional academic explanation is diffusion, the idea that the story spread from a single point of origin, probably Mesopotamia, where the oldest written versions are found, and was carried by trade and migration to the rest of the world. But this explanation has significant problems, not least because several of the non-Mesopotamian versions contain details that are not present in the Mesopotamian versions, but are consistent with each other, suggesting that they may be drawing on a common pre-Mesopotamian source rather than on the Mesopotamian tradition itself. The most important comparison for our purposes is between the Mesopotamian and the Hebrew flood traditions, which are clearly related but which differ in ways that are theologically and historically significant. In the Mesopotamian version, in both the Sumerian and Akkadian tellings, the flood is caused by the gods who are disturbed by the noise that humanity is making, an almost comically mundane motivation that has struck scholars as an evasion or simplification of some deeper original meaning. In the Hebrew version, the flood is caused by human wickedness and the corruption of the earth. In the War Enoch elaboration, the flood is caused specifically by the genetic and cultural contamination introduced by the Watchers and the Nephilim. These three versions are not simply different stories about the same event. They are different explanations of the same event, and the 1 Enoch version, despite being the latest of the three in the surviving written record, preserves elements of the tradition that appear to be considerably older, elements that the Mesopotamian versions have obscured or lost. One of the most significant of these elements is the explicit connection between the flood and the problem of the Nephilim bloodline. In 1st Enoch and in related Second Temple Jewish texts, the flood is not simply God washing away sinful humanity. It is a targeted biological intervention, an attempt to eliminate a specific genetic inheritance from the human population. The surviving human beings, Noah and his family, are preserved not simply because they are morally good, but because they represent a genetically uncontaminated human lineage that can serve as the foundation for the post-flood world. The flood, in this reading, is essentially a selective breeding event on a planetary scale. But here is the paradox at the heart of the narrative. The paradox that generates everything that follows in the post-flood world, and that is the subject of everything we will be examining for the rest of this exploration. If the flood was meant to eliminate the Nephilim bloodline, it failed. The Bible itself tells us it failed, because within a very few generations of the flood, we start encountering giants again. Not as a gradual re-emergence of some new phenomenon, but as an established, named, categorized phenomenon that the Israelites and their neighbors had evidently been living with for some time. The giant races of the post-flood world are not described as surprising or unprecedented. They are described as known quantities, as established peoples with names and territories and histories. The Rephaim, the Anakim, the Emim, the Zamzumim, the Zuzim. These are not metaphors. They are named peoples, described with the specificity of historical record and the physical characteristics attributed to them. Their extraordinary stature and their unusual physiological features are exactly the characteristics that the pre-flood Nephilim tradition would predict in a population carrying a diluted but still active non-human genetic inheritance. How did the Nephilim bloodline get from the pre-flood world to the post-flood world? That is the question at the center of everything we are examining, and the answer, if there is one, must be found at the intersection of ancient texts, archaeological evidence, and the emerging science of ancient genomics. Because it turns out that modern genetics, specifically the analysis of ancient DNA recovered from the bones of people who lived thousands of years ago, has begun to reveal a picture of human prehistory that looks nothing like the gradual linear development that was assumed for most of the 20th century. What geneticists have found instead is a history full of sudden discontinuities, of populations that appear and disappear without apparent explanation, of genetic markers that cannot be accounted for by known human evolutionary pathways, and of anomalous individuals and populations whose genetic profiles suggest an ancestry that does not fit any known human lineage. We are not yet in a position to prove that these genetic anomalies are the physical residue of what the ancient texts call the Nephilim, but the convergence between what the ancient texts describe and what the genetics is revealing is remarkable enough to demand serious attention. The world is not what we were taught it was. The history of humanity is not the clean, linear, fully understood narrative that gets taught in schools and universities. Something happened in the deep past, something that left its mark not just in the mythology and the religious texts and the archaeological record, but in our genes, in the very DNA that we carry in every cell of our bodies. And the evidence for what that something was is more substantial, more specific, and more compelling than most people have ever been told. The pre-flood world, according to the ancient sources, was a world in transformation, a world in which the original human genetic inheritance was being systematically altered by the introduction of a non-human element. The flood was meant to end that transformation, to reset the biological clock to zero and start again with a clean human lineage. Instead, it accelerated the very process it was meant to stop because the Nephilim bloodline was not carried only in the obvious giants, the clearly non-human beings who were the first-generation offspring of the Watchers. It was carried in diluted but functional form in the human population itself, in the men and women who had interbred with the Nephilim over generations and who looked, by the time of the flood, more or less like ordinary human beings, but who carried in their DNA the specific markers of that ancient non-human inheritance. When Noah and his family came off the ark, they did not represent a perfectly pure and uncontaminated human lineage. They represented the best available option, the least contaminated lineage that could be found by the time the flood came, but not a perfectly clean reset. And as the post-flood population expanded and diversified, as the descendants of Noah spread across the world and established the nations and peoples of the ancient world, those latent genetic markers spread with them, expressing themselves more or less strongly in different populations and different individuals, depending on which combinations of genes happen to come together in any particular generation. This is the bloodline that survived the flood, not the original Nephilim with their extraordinary heights and their divine parentage, but the genetic memory of that divine parentage, the specific combinations of sequences in the human genome that the Watchers introduced when they took human wives and fathered children on the earth, the molecular record of the event that the ancient world called the fall of the sons of God. It is, if the ancient texts are to be believed, still with us, still circulating in the human population, still occasionally expressing itself in anomalous individuals and populations, still waiting, in a sense, to be fully understood. The story of how it survived, how it spread, what it has done to human history, and what the evidence for its persistence looks like in the archaeological and genetic record is one of the most important untold stories of our time, and we are only just beginning to tell it. The geography of giants. Post-flood Nephilim and the archaeology of impossible bones. The Book of Numbers, chapter 13, contains one of the most arresting passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. Moses has sent 12 spies into the land of Canaan to scout the territory before the Israelite invasion, and 10 of the 12 come back with a report that is essentially a report of terror. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. And then the passage that has haunted interpreters for 3,000 years. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. This is not a story about seeing angels or divine beings. This is a story about seeing people, living people, inhabitants of specific named cities in a specific named region, and what made those people so terrifying was their size. The Israelite spies, grown men who had survived 40 years in the wilderness, who had fought battles and endured hardships that would break most people, looked at these inhabitants of Canaan and felt like grasshoppers. The comparison is not poetic exaggeration in the context of the text. It is a literal report of perceived proportions. If a normal-sized man feels like a grasshopper next to another human being, that other human being is not simply tall. They are on a different scale entirely. The Anakim, the descendants of Anak referenced in the Numbers passage, are one of several post-flood giant races mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures, and they are the best documented of the group. They appear first in the book of Genesis as the inhabitants of Hebron, the city later associated with Abraham and with the tomb of the patriarchs. They appear again in Numbers and in Deuteronomy, where they are described as a people so fearsome that even the mighty Emim of Moab fled before them, and they appear in the book of Joshua, where the conquest of Canaan includes a specific military campaign directed at eliminating the Anakim from the land, a campaign that Joshua pursues with the same urgency and the same sense of divine mandate that characterized the wars against other Canaanite peoples, but with an added edge of something that reads very much like existential dread. The Anakim are not just a political or military threat. They are, in the logic of the text, a biological threat, a remnant of the pre-flood contamination that the flood was supposed to have eliminated, and their continued existence in Canaan is a standing affront to the divine purpose that the Israelites believed they were serving. The book of Joshua records that Joshua destroyed the Anakim from the hill country of Judah and from all Israel. But then comes a crucial qualification. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory, but some remained in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. These are Philistine cities, and this detail is not incidental because it explains exactly how the giant warriors of the Philistines, who appear in the books of Samuel fighting against David and his warriors, came to be where they were. They were the remnants of the Anakim who had taken refuge in the coastal cities of the Philistines when Joshua cleared them from the hill country. They did not disappear. They retreated, and they continued to reproduce, and their descendants were still fighting wars several generations later. The most famous of these Philistine giants is, of course, Goliath of Gath, whose story in 1 Samuel is perhaps the best-known combat narrative in the Bible. Goliath's height is given in the Masoretic text as 6 cubits and a span, which is approximately 9 feet, 9 inches in modern measurements. The Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls fragment of Samuel give a slightly different measurement, 4 cubits and a span, approximately 6 feet, 9 inches, which is still well above the average height of the period, but considerably more within the range of natural human variation. Scholars have debated which measurement is more original, but for our purposes, the specific number is less important than what the text says about Goliath's family context, because Goliath is not alone. The text of 2 Samuel chapter 21 and its parallel in 1 Chronicles chapter 20 records that Goliath had brothers and that David's warriors killed 4 of them. The passage describes these brothers in terms that confirm they were part of the same anomalous lineage. One of them, Ishbi-Benob, had a spear weighing 300 shekels of bronze. Another, Saph, is simply described as one of the descendants of the Rapha. Another, unnamed in Samuel but called Lami in Chronicles and described as the brother of Goliath of Gath, was a warrior with a spear shaft like a weaver's rod. And the fourth, the most remarkable, had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in total, and is described as also born to the giant in Gath. This last detail, the hexadactyly, the extra fingers and toes, appears multiple times in the biblical accounts of the giant warriors and has attracted considerable attention in modern scholarship. Polydactyly, the condition of having extra digits, is a known genetic trait in humans, and it does have a hereditary component. But what makes the biblical account interesting is that this trait appears specifically in individuals who are already identified by their unusual size and their descent from giant lineages. If the trait were randomly distributed in the general population, you would not expect it to concentrate in a specific family or lineage. The fact that it does concentrate in the family of the giants of Gath, who are themselves identified as descendants of the Rapha, the Rephaim, the giant race of Transjordan, suggests that it is a marker of the same anomalous genetic inheritance that produces the unusual stature in the first place. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of linked trait complex you would expect to find in a population carrying a distinct and unusual genetic inheritance. The Rephaim are arguably the most important of the post-flood giant races for our purposes, because they are the most extensively documented and because the geographical territory associated with them, the Transjordan Plateau and the region east of the Jordan River, is also the territory where some of the most significant archaeological evidence for anomalous prehistoric populations has been found. The Rephaim are mentioned in Genesis chapter 14, where Chedorlaomer and his allies defeat them at Ashtaroth Karnaim, which is in the Bashan region of what is now southwestern Syria. They appear in Deuteronomy chapter 2 in a remarkable passage that links them explicitly to the Anakim, stating that the Emim who lived in the territory of Moab were once considered Rephaim, as tall as the Anakites, but that the Moabites called them Emim. The text is providing a geographic and terminological key to a web of related giant peoples who occupied the entire region east and west of the Jordan, from the Negev in the south to the Bashan in the north. The most remarkable individual Rephate in the biblical text is Og, king of Bashan, who appears in Numbers chapter 21 and in Deuteronomy chapters 1 and 3. Og is described in Deuteronomy as the last of the Rephaim. When the Israelites conquered his territory, they were careful to record his dimensions. His bed was decorated with iron and was more than 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. 9 cubits is approximately 13 to 14 feet, even allowing for the fact that royal beds of the ancient Near East were typically somewhat larger than their occupants required. For ceremonial reasons, Og was clearly a very large individual. His capital city was Edrei, modern Deraa, in southern Syria, and he ruled the entire region of Bashan, which was considered one of the most fertile and desirable territories in the ancient Near East. The fact that the Israelites found it necessary to record his bed dimensions in a historical text suggests that his size was genuinely exceptional, remarkable enough to be worth documenting for posterity. The territory of Bashan, Og's kingdom, is also the territory most closely associated with Mount Hermon, the mountain where, according to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers first descended to earth and made their oath to take human wives. This geographic overlap is not coincidental. The ancient tradition consistently places the original Watcher descent, the founding event of the Nephilim lineage, in the same region where the last known representatives of the Nephilim bloodline held their territory in the post-flood era. Mount Hermon sits at the northern edge of the Bashan region, dominating the landscape for miles in every direction, and its religious significance in both the pre-Israelite Canaanite tradition and the later Israelite tradition is enormous. It is described in the Psalms as a mountain where God's blessing flows like dew, and it is the site of the transfiguration of Jesus in the New Testament, an event that has deep resonances with the earlier tradition of divine beings descending from the same mountain to mix with humanity. The geographic distribution of the post-flood giant races as recorded in the Hebrew Bible covers essentially the entire territory of the ancient Near East. The Anakim are concentrated in the hill country of Canaan, particularly around Hebron and the cities of the south. The Rephaim and their related peoples, the Emim and the Zamzumim and the Zuzim, occupy the Transjordanian Plateau. The remnants of the Anakim take refuge in the Philistine coastal cities. Goliath and his brothers represent this Philistine remnant population, and there are hints in the text of related anomalous populations in other regions, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the territories beyond the immediate zone of Israelite concern. The picture that emerges is not of isolated giant individuals scattered randomly through the population, but of specific peoples with specific territories and specific cultural identities, peoples whose anomalous physical characteristics were consistent enough across generations to be a defining feature of their group identity. This is exactly what you would expect to find in a population carrying a distinct and unusual genetic inheritance. When a specific set of genetic variants is present in a breeding population and produces distinctive physical characteristics, those characteristics will appear consistently across generations in that population. They will become, in effect, the genetic signature of that population. The giant races of the ancient Near East were not simply tall. They were a genetically distinct population, or a cluster of related populations, carrying a specific inheritance that produced their characteristic physical features. And the Bible, far from being embarrassed by this fact, documents it with considerable specificity, naming the peoples, describing their territories, and recording what happened to them over centuries of interaction with the Israelites and their neighbors. What archaeology has to say about this documented history of giant peoples in the ancient Near East is a complex and contested subject, but it is a subject with considerably more substance than the mainstream academic narrative typically acknowledges. The problem of giant skeletons is one of the most fraught topics in the intersection of archaeology and alternative history because it has been the subject of so much hoaxing and so much uncritical, credulous reporting on one side, and so much reflexive dismissal on the other, that getting to the actual evidence requires cutting through layers of misinformation in both directions. The hoaxes are real and they are numerous. Starting in the late 19th century and accelerating dramatically in the internet age, there has been a cottage industry in fake photographs of giant skeletons, digitally manipulated images that have been passed around online as evidence for ancient giant races. The most famous of these is a series of images that originated as entries in a worth 1,000 digital art competition in 2004 and that have been repeatedly recycled as genuine archaeological finds ever since. The fact that these hoaxes are easy to debunk has led many mainstream commentators to conclude that all claims about giant skeletons are equally fraudulent, which is itself a logical error. The existence of fake photographs does not prove that nothing real exists to be photographed. What does the genuine archaeological record show? It shows, first, that there is a well-documented population-level variation in human stature across prehistoric and ancient populations that is considerably greater than the variation we see in modern populations. The skeletal record from the Levant, the region of ancient Canaan and Transjordan, where the biblical giant races are located, shows evidence of populations in the Bronze and Iron Ages that were significantly taller on average than both their contemporaries in other regions and their successors in the same region. This does not prove the existence of individual giants of the extreme heights described in the biblical texts, but it does establish that the region identified by the biblical texts as the home of the giant races was genuinely home to unusually tall populations in the relevant historical period. Second, there is a substantial but largely unpublicized accumulation of individual skeletal finds from the ancient Near East and surrounding regions that represent individuals of extraordinary stature. These finds range from individuals in the 7-foot range, which is outside normal, but not outside the known range of human gigantism, to considerably taller individuals that represent genuine anomalies in the human skeletal record. The problem with most of these finds is not that they do not exist. It is that they exist in institutional collections, and private finds scattered across multiple countries have been inconsistently documented and have in many cases been classified in ways that effectively make them difficult to access and study as a coherent data set. The Smithsonian Institution in the United States has been the subject of extensive conspiracy theories claiming that it has systematically suppressed evidence of giant skeletons, and while the specific claims are often exaggerated or unsupported, the underlying complaint that American institutions have been less than transparent about anomalous skeletal finds has some basis in documented fact. The most well-documented example is the series of newspaper reports from the late 19th and early 20th century published in major American newspapers, including the New York Times and the Smithsonian's own publications, reporting on skeletal finds of individuals ranging from 7 to 12 feet in height from burial mounds across the eastern United States, particularly in the Ohio and Mississippi Valley regions. These reports are real. The newspapers are real. The names of the archaeologists who made the finds are real and verifiable. What is conspicuously absent is any systematic follow-up study of the bones themselves or any public accounting of where they are now. The mound builder culture of Eastern North America is itself a significant piece of the puzzle we are examining. The earthwork mounds built by the various cultures of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, from the Adena culture going back to around 1000 BCE to the Great Hopewell and Mississippian traditions, were clearly the products of a sophisticated organized society capable of massive coordinated labor projects and possessed of a complex cosmological worldview expressed in the geometry and astronomical alignment of the earthworks. The tradition that these mounds contained the remains of a race of giants predates the European contact period and is found in the oral traditions of multiple Native American peoples who had no connection to each other. The Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Shawnee, and other eastern woodlands peoples all have traditions of a race of giant beings, sometimes described as cannibals, who were the original inhabitants of the mound-building territories and who were destroyed by the ancestors of the modern tribes in a series of wars. This tradition is exactly parallel to the biblical tradition of the Rephaim and the Anakim, the giant races that occupied the land before the Israelites arrived and were systematically destroyed in the conquest. The parallel structure of the narratives across such a vast geographic separation is one of the most important pieces of evidence for the universality of the Nephilim phenomenon. If giant races were a purely Semitic theological concept, you would not expect to find essentially the same tradition, with the same elements of unusual size, unusual behavior, and violent conflict with arriving human populations in the oral histories of people who had no conceivable contact with the ancient Near East. The fact that you do find it there, and in indigenous traditions across the Americas, across the Pacific, and across sub-Saharan Africa, suggests that the tradition is preserving the memory of something real that happened globally, something that affected multiple human populations in multiple geographic regions, not something that was invented by one culture and exported to others. The most significant individual skeletal find in recent memory that has a genuine bearing on the Nephilim question is the Lovelock cave discovery in Nevada. In 1912, miners excavating guano deposits in a cave near Lovelock, Nevada, discovered a large cache of artifacts and human remains that had been preserved by the dry desert conditions. Among the finds were mummified remains showing individuals with red hair, a feature that is extremely unusual in Native American populations, and that has attracted enormous attention and controversy. Some of the remains appeared to represent individuals of unusual stature. The Paiute people of Nevada have a tradition that exactly matches this find, a tradition of a race of red-haired cannibalistic giants called the Siteka, who were the enemies of their ancestors and who were eventually exterminated by an alliance of tribes who trapped them in a cave and smoked them out. The Paiute tradition specifically describes the Siteka as using boats made of tool reeds to travel across what was then a large inland lake covering much of what is now Nevada, and tool reed artifacts were among the finds at Lovelock Cave. The correspondence between the archaeological find and the oral tradition is precise enough to be remarkable, and the physical characteristics described in the oral tradition, the unusual hair color, the extraordinary size, match what was actually found in the cave well enough to raise very serious questions about whether the Paiute tradition is preserving the memory of a real encounter with an anomalous human population. Similar finds and similar traditions exist in the archaeological record of numerous other regions. In Sardinia, the Nuragic civilization built thousands of stone towers of extraordinary engineering sophistication, and the skeletal remains from Nuragic sites show a population that was significantly taller on average than their contemporaries in mainland Italy and Greece. The Nuragic people have been linked by some researchers to the tradition of the Shardana, the Sea Peoples, who appear in Egyptian records of the Late Bronze Age collapse, and the Sea Peoples themselves have been proposed as a possible dispersal mechanism for anomalous genetic lineages from the ancient Near East into the Western Mediterranean. In Peru, the pre-Inca culture of Paracas left behind elongated skulls that have attracted enormous controversy, with mainstream archaeology attributing the elongation to deliberate cranial deformation in infancy, but with several DNA analyses suggesting genetic markers that do not match any known indigenous South American population or any other known human population. In Ireland and Britain, the megalithic tomb builders who raised the great stone monuments of Newgrange and Avebury and Stonehenge left behind skeletal remains that, when studied in aggregate, show individuals of considerable stature, and the oral traditions of the Celtic peoples consistently describe these monument builders as a race of giants who preceded the Celts in the land. The convergence of archaeological evidence, skeletal anomalies, and consistent cross-cultural oral traditions pointing to the historical existence of anomalous human populations with unusual physical characteristics is not something that can be dismissed simply by debunking individual hoaxes or pointing to the difficulty of verifying specific claims. The pattern is too consistent and too geographically broad for that. What remains to be explained is the mechanism, the biological and genetic reality that would explain how such populations could exist and how they could be connected to the pre-flood narrative of the Nephilim. The answer to that question, or at least the beginning of an answer, is now coming from the most unlikely of sources, the laboratory. Ancient DNA analysis, a technology that would have been considered science fiction 30 years ago, is now revealing things about the deep human past that are forcing a fundamental reconsideration of everything we thought we knew about the origins and development of the human species. And some of what it is revealing looks very much like what the ancient texts have been saying all along. The discovery of the Denisovans in 2010 was the opening shot in what has become a revolution in paleoanthropology. The Denisovans were identified not from a fossil skeleton, but from a single finger bone and a few teeth found in a cave in Siberia. And what identified them was not their anatomy, which was not sufficiently distinct from modern humans to be immediately recognized as a separate species, but their DNA, which was dramatically different from both modern human DNA and Neanderthal DNA, different enough to identify them as a third distinct lineage of archaic humans that had lived alongside and interbred with both. The Denisovans were not a hypothetical species reconstructed from fragmentary bones. They were a real population that left verifiable traces in the human genome, and those traces are still present in living human populations today. What the discovery of the Denisovans tells us is that the human evolutionary story is considerably more complex than the textbook version. Homo sapiens did not evolve in isolation and gradually replace all other human species through straightforward competition. We evolved in a world that contained multiple other human lineages. We interbred with those lineages repeatedly, and we carry the genetic legacy of those interactions in our current genomes. The Denisovan contribution to the human genome is not negligible. Modern Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian populations carry up to 5% Denisovan ancestry. Tibetan populations carry a specific Denisovan variant of the gene EPS1 that allows them to survive at high altitudes where other humans would suffer fatal hypoxia. This is not a trace fossil in the genome. This is a functional genetic inheritance from an archaic human lineage that has been actively maintained in the population because it confers a significant survival advantage in specific environmental conditions. Now here is the key question. If we can document the genetic survival of Denisovan ancestry in modern human populations, and if the Denisovans are themselves only one of the archaic human lineages we have so far identified, what else might be out there? What other archaic lineages might have contributed to the modern human genome in ways that we have not yet fully characterized? And is it possible that some of what the ancient texts call the Nephilim bloodline corresponds, at a biological level, to the genetic contribution of one or more of these archaic or unidentified human lineages? These are not questions with settled answers. They are questions at the frontier of current scientific research, and the researchers who are doing the most important work in this area are not, for the most part, asking them in the terms that we are using here. They are not looking for the Nephilim. They are looking for the genetic signatures of archaic introgression in the modern human genome, which is a technically precise way of asking exactly the same question. And what they are finding is extraordinary. The genetics of the impossible, ancient DNA, archaic introgression, and the molecular archaeology of the Nephilim. In 2014, a study published in the journal Nature analyzed genetic data from modern human populations worldwide and found evidence for what the researchers described as a ghost population, an archaic human lineage that had contributed to the genomes of sub-Saharan African populations, but that had left no fossil remains and could not be identified with any known archaic human species. This population, which contributed approximately 2% of the ancestry of certain West African populations, appears to have diverged from the main human lineage somewhere between 360,000 and 1.04 million years ago, making it more distantly related to modern humans than even the Neanderthals, which diverged from our lineage approximately 550,000 to 750,000 years ago. The Denisovans and the Neanderthals and the newly discovered ghost population represent three different archaic lineages that all contributed to the modern human genome, and subsequent research has continued to find evidence for additional ghost populations, additional unidentified archaic lineages that contributed to the human genome in ways that our current fossil record cannot fully account for. The discovery of these ghost populations is not a fringe finding. It has been published in the world's most prestigious scientific journals, confirmed by multiple independent research groups using different methodologies, and is now accepted as established fact in the field of paleoanthropology. What remains highly contested is the interpretation of these findings, specifically the question of what the archaic lineages were, where they came from, and what the full extent of their contribution to the modern human genome actually was. The standard scientific model assumes that all of these archaic lineages were members of the genus Homo, evolutionary cousins of our own species, who diverged from us at various points in the deep past and who were related to us through the normal processes of biological evolution. This assumption is reasonable given the evidence we currently have. But it is an assumption, not a proven fact, and it is an assumption that the ancient texts would challenge on specific and precise grounds. The Book of Enoch and the related texts do not describe the Watchers as evolutionary cousins of humanity. They describe them as a fundamentally different order of being, one that had existed before and apart from the human world, and that intervened in human development from outside. In modern terms, you might say they describe the Watchers as originating from outside the normal evolutionary tree of life on Earth. This is a claim that science, as currently constituted, simply cannot evaluate because science has no methodology for distinguishing between a very distantly related but still terrestrial lineage and something of genuinely different origin. What science can do is identify the genetic signatures of archaic introgression in the modern human genome and characterize how unusual those signatures are relative to known human variation. And some of those signatures are very unusual indeed. The genetic variants associated with the Denisovan lineage in modern populations include not just EPAS1, but a cluster of immune system variants, neurological variants, and physical trait variants that are consistently different from what you find in modern human populations without Denisovan ancestry. The Denisovan contribution to the modern human immune system, documented in populations of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, includes variants of the HLA genes, the major histocompatibility complex, that are so different from all other known human variants that researchers initially thought they were sequencing errors. They were not. They were genuine sequences that appear to come from a lineage with a dramatically different evolutionary history from any known human population. The physical traits associated with Denisovan ancestry in modern populations are also remarkable. The broad facial structure, the large teeth, and the distinctive jaw morphology associated with modern populations that carry high levels of Denisovan ancestry, such as Aboriginal Australians and some Melanesian groups, are features that are visible in the fragmentary physical remains attributed to the Denisovans themselves, specifically the enormous molar teeth found in Denisova Cave that are what first led researchers to suspect they had found a new lineage. These teeth are larger than any known human teeth and were initially thought to belong to a primitive hominin much more distantly related to modern humans than the Denisovans turned out to be. The physical scale implied by those teeth is consistent with a body plan significantly larger than modern humans, though the extreme fragmentary nature of the Denisovan fossil record makes it impossible to reconstruct the full body size with any confidence. Here, however, is where a discovery made in 2019 becomes critically important. Tibetan scientists excavating a cave in Siahe in the Gansu province of China found a fragment of a jawbone that was initially attributed to an early modern human. DNA analysis of the protein content of the bone using a technique called proteomics that can recover molecular information from bones too old or too poorly preserved for conventional DNA analysis revealed that the Siahe mandible belonged not to a modern human, but to a Denisovan. This was significant for several reasons. First, the Siahe Denisovan lived at an altitude of about 11,000 feet, consistent with the genetic evidence that Denisovans adapted to high altitudes and passed that adaptation to the modern Tibetan people. Second, the jawbone itself, even from the fragment recovered, was considerably larger than normal human jaws, consistent with the giant teeth found at Denisova Cave and suggesting that the Denisovans were indeed significantly larger than modern humans on average. A third Denisovan find, made in 2022 in the Baishia Karst Cave on the Tibetan Plateau, extended the known range of Denisovan habitation and confirmed their adaptation to extreme high-altitude environments. The accumulating picture of the Denisovans is of a large-bodied archaic human lineage that was adapted to cold, high-altitude environments that was technologically sophisticated enough to make the ivory jewelry found at Denisova Cave that interbred repeatedly with modern humans at various points in prehistory, and that left a significant genetic legacy in the modern human population, particularly in populations inhabiting the extreme environments, high altitudes, and sub-equatorial regions, where Denisovan adaptations confer the most advantage. This picture has obvious and direct resonances with the ancient texts' descriptions of the Nephilim and the post-flood giant races. The Nephilim and their descendants are consistently described as physically enormous. The post-flood giant peoples, the Rephaim and the Anakim and the others, are described as inhabiting specific geographic territories: the hill country of Canaan, the highlands of Bashan, the elevated regions of Transjordan. The convergence between the physical characteristics attributed to the Nephilim lineage in the ancient texts and the physical characteristics that genetics and the fossil record are now attributing to the Denisovans is not conclusive, but it is striking enough to demand serious examination. What would we expect to find in the modern human genome if the Nephilim narrative is historically accurate in some form? We would expect to find genetic variants that are present in some modern populations, but not others, that cannot be accounted for by known evolutionary processes within the human lineage that are associated with unusual physical characteristics, including unusual stature, that cluster geographically in regions associated with the post-flood giant peoples of the ancient Near East, and that show up in the genome as anomalous or outlying compared to the normal distribution of human genetic variation. We would, in other words, expect to find exactly what ancient DNA researchers have been finding: a complex picture of introgression from archaic lineages that left genetic signatures quite distinct from the normal range of human variation. The most recent and comprehensive analysis of archaic introgression in the modern human genome was published in 2020 in the journal Cell and identified multiple distinct archaic lineages that contributed to modern human ancestry, including several that cannot be matched to any known fossil species. The authors of this study described the situation as one of the most important discoveries in human evolutionary biology and noted that the full extent of archaic introgression into the modern human genome was likely far greater than currently characterized. They estimated that as much as 2 to 5% of the modern human genome might consist of inherited sequences from archaic lineages other than the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, and that some of these uncharacterized archaic contributions might be very ancient, coming from lineages that diverged from the main human lineage long before the Neanderthal-Denisovan split. The specific region of the human genome that has attracted the most attention in this context is chromosome 12, which contains a dense cluster of genes associated with physical stature, neurological function, and immune response that show unusual patterns of variation in modern human populations. The stature-associated variants on chromosome 12 include several that are found at unusually high frequency in populations from the ancient Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean, exactly the geographic regions associated with the post-flood giant peoples of the biblical texts. The neurological variants in the same genomic region are associated with unusual patterns of brain development and cognitive function. Variants that in heterozygous carriers, those who have one copy of the variant rather than two, may produce what some researchers have cautiously described as enhanced capabilities in spatial reasoning and pattern recognition, and that in homozygous carriers produce severe developmental disorders. This pattern, enhanced capabilities in heterozygous carriers paired with severe disorders in homozygous carriers, is a hallmark of variants that entered the human population through archaic introgression. It is a well-documented phenomenon in both Neanderthal and Denisovan-derived variants, and it reflects the fact that these archaic sequences evolved in a different genetic context than the modern human genome and produce very different effects depending on whether they are present in one or two copies. The ancient texts' descriptions of the Nephilim and their descendants as beings of extraordinary capability, unusual physical characteristics, and sometimes disturbing or antisocial behavior are entirely consistent with what we would expect to find in a population carrying a high density of such introgressed archaic variants. But the genetic story does not stop with the identification of archaic introgression in general. It gets considerably more specific and considerably more interesting when we look at the genetic record of specific ancient populations from the ancient Near East and surrounding regions. The ancient DNA revolution has, in the past decade, produced an extraordinary wealth of genomic data from ancient human remains, ranging from Paleolithic hunter-gatherers of 40,000 years ago to Bronze Age populations of 4,000 years ago. And the picture that emerges from this data, particularly for the Bronze Age populations of the ancient Near East, is one of remarkable genetic complexity and repeated population discontinuities that suggest something far more complicated than the simple story of agricultural expansion and population growth that conventional archaeology assumed. The Bronze Age populations of the Levant, the coastal and hill country regions of modern Israel and Palestine and Lebanon and Syria, show a genetic profile that is itself a mixture of several distinct ancestral components, including a substantial component of what geneticists call Iran Chalcolithic ancestry, a component associated with the early farming populations of the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, and a component of ancient North Eurasian ancestry that came into the Levant relatively recently in the Bronze Age, and that appears to have arrived in association with the massive demographic disruptions of the early Bronze Age collapse and the later Bronze Age collapse of the Late Bronze period. Embedded within this complex mixture are pockets of genetic variation that do not fit comfortably into any of these known ancestral components that appear in several population samples to represent an additional ancestry source that has not yet been fully characterized. One of the most intriguing of these uncharacterized genetic pockets comes from ancient DNA samples from the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age populations of the Negev and the Transjordanian Plateau, precisely the geographic regions most closely associated in the biblical texts with the Rephaim and the Anakim. These populations, who were living in these territories in the period immediately preceding the historical records that describe the giant peoples, show a genetic profile that includes not just the standard Levantine Bronze Age ancestry components, but an additional component that has a higher proportion of what geneticists call deep lineage ancestry, genetic sequences that trace back to human populations of great antiquity that diverged from the main modern human lineage very early, possibly more than 100,000 years ago. This deep lineage ancestry is found at low levels in most modern human populations as a background contribution from the very earliest modern humans in Africa. but in the Negev and Transjordanian samples, it appears at levels that are difficult to explain through normal demographic processes. It is as if these populations had a higher proportion of genetic material from very ancient human lineages than their neighbors did, a genetic signature of admixture with a deeply diverged population that was present in this specific geographic region, and that is not found in the same proportions anywhere else. This is not proof that the ancient Near East was home to a Nephilim-derived population in the Bronze Age. It is, however, a finding that is precisely consistent with what the biblical texts claim about the specific geographic distribution of the Rephaim and the Anakim. The texts say that these anomalous populations were concentrated in the Negev, the hill country of Judah, and the Transjordanian plateau. The genetics, such as they are, shows an anomalous genetic component concentrated in the same geographic area. The convergence is not conclusive, but it is not nothing. The science of ancient genomics is advancing at extraordinary speed, and the full implications of what has already been found have not yet been absorbed by the broader academic and public discourse. What the geneticists are showing us, piecemeal, and in the technical language of their discipline, is that the human past was genuinely stranger and more complex than the story we have been telling ourselves. There were more of us than we thought, and we were more different from each other than we thought, and the mixings and separations and extinctions that produced the human genome as it currently exists were more numerous and more dramatic than any previous model anticipated. Into this genuinely strange and complex picture, the ancient testimony about the Nephilim and their genetic legacy fits not as an impossibility to be dismissed, but as a hypothesis to be taken seriously. The specific genetic markers associated with the Nephilim hypothesis, if we were to go looking for them, would include unusually high stature in some individuals and family lines, unusual physical features including possible polydactyly and elongated skulls, unusually high activity of the genes associated with growth hormone and growth hormone receptor function, anomalous patterns of immune system variation suggesting archaic introgression, and neurological variants associated with both exceptional capabilities and unusual behavioral profiles. These are all real phenomena that exist in the modern human population and that have been studied in various contexts. What has not been done, because no mainstream researcher has had either the inclination or the institutional support to do it, is a systematic study of whether these phenomena cluster together in specific populations and specific genetic backgrounds in ways that would suggest a common underlying ancestry connecting them. There is, however, a growing body of indirect evidence suggesting that they do cluster in ways that are at least consistent with the Nephilim hypothesis. The genetic studies of populations with unusually high rates of gigantism and acromegaly, conditions involving abnormal growth hormone activity, have found that these conditions cluster in specific family lines and specific populations in ways that suggest a heritable component beyond the known mutations in the growth hormone and growth hormone receptor genes. Some cases of familial gigantism do not involve any of the currently characterized mutations and appear to involve a different, uncharacterized mechanism for abnormal growth regulation. Whether this uncharacterized mechanism represents the survival of an archaic introgressed sequence in these family lines is not currently known. Similarly, the genetic studies of polydactyly, the condition of extra digits that appears in the biblical accounts of the giant warriors, have found that polydactyly can be caused by mutations in at least 15 different genes, and that the different genetic forms of polydactyly have very different geographic and population distributions, with some forms clustering heavily in specific ethnic and geographic groups in ways that suggest a founder effect from a specific ancestral population. One form of polydactyly in particular, postaxial polydactyly type A, shows an unusually high frequency in populations from the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East, exactly the geographic regions associated with the giant races of antiquity. Whether this is coincidence or whether it represents the genetic memory of a specific ancestral population that carried both unusual stature and polydactyly as linked traits in a common genetic background is a question that has not been seriously investigated. The most tantalizing piece of the genetic puzzle is also the most controversial, and it involves a finding from the study of the Paracas skulls of Peru. The Paracas culture, which flourished on the southern coast of what is now Peru, roughly between 800 BCE and 100 CE, left behind a remarkable collection of elongated skulls that were first described by Peruvian archaeologist Julio Tello in the 1920s. Most of these skulls show the effects of deliberate cranial deformation, a practice widespread in the ancient world in which an infant's head is bound to produce an elongated shape. But a significant subset of the Paracas skulls show features that cannot be explained by cranial deformation alone. Their cranial volume is up to 2.5 times larger than a normal human skull. They have only one parietal plate rather than two, which is a structural feature that is not produced by deformation and that does not occur in any normal human skull. Their weight is significantly greater than the heaviest normal human skulls. In 2014, a researcher named L.A. Marzulli organized an independent DNA analysis of samples from 5 Paracas skulls, working with a geneticist who requested anonymity and using samples that had been carefully collected to avoid contamination. The preliminary results of this analysis, which were not published in a peer-reviewed journal and must therefore be treated with appropriate caution, reportedly found mitochondrial DNA haplogroups that were not consistent with any known Native American ancestry, with European ancestry, or with African ancestry, and that the researchers described as representing mutations that were unknown in any known human genetic database. A subsequent, more rigorous analysis organized by a different team found haplogroups that are known in human populations but are found primarily in European populations with a secondary distribution in the Middle East, which is equally difficult to explain given the presumed isolation of pre-Columbian South America. Neither of these analyses is conclusive. The sample sizes are tiny, the chain of custody is not as rigorous as it would need to be for peer-reviewed publication, and the interpretation of the findings has been contested by mainstream archaeologists who attribute the unusual skull morphology entirely to deformation and who are skeptical of any claim that the Paracas people had unusual or non-indigenous ancestry. But the findings are not nothing. They are data points that, if confirmed by larger and more rigorous studies, would be genuinely extraordinary and would require a major revision of both the archaeological consensus on pre-Columbian South America and the biological consensus on the range of human cranial variation. What connects all of these disparate threads, the ancient texts, the archaeological finds, the anomalous skeletal remains, and the emerging genetics, is the consistent suggestion that the human past contained populations that were genuinely physically different from the modern human norm, that these populations were concentrated in specific geographic regions associated in the ancient record with the descendants of the Nephilim, that they left genetic traces in modern human populations that have not yet been fully characterized, and that the story the ancient texts tell about their origin and their history is more historically grounded than the mainstream consensus acknowledges. We are not yet at the point where science can confirm the Nephilim narrative in any direct sense. We may never be, given the nature of the evidence and the methodological limitations of ancient DNA analysis. But we are past the point where the hypothesis can be dismissed as pure mythology with no empirical support. The bones are real, the genetics is real, the ancient texts are real, and the convergence between them is real enough to demand a serious and open-minded investigation that the mainstream academic world has been conspicuously reluctant to undertake. The bloodline dispersed. Giants among nations, forbidden archaeology, and the global Nephilim network. The story of the Nephilim bloodline does not end in the ancient Near East. It follows the dispersal of human populations from that region across the globe, and the evidence for it, in various forms and in various states of preservation, appears in cultures that had no known contact with each other and no known access to the Semitic traditions in which the Nephilim narrative is most fully preserved. To trace this dispersal is to undertake a global survey of anomalous populations, anomalous individuals, anomalous skeletal remains, and anomalous cultural traditions that all share certain key features with the original Nephilim template. It is an exercise in connecting dots across an enormous geographic and temporal canvas, and the picture that emerges when the dots are connected is of a bloodline that has been far more persistent, far more geographically widespread, and far more culturally influential than any conventional account of human history acknowledges. We need to start with the mechanisms of dispersal, because the Nephilim bloodline did not spread through the world the way a purely mythological tradition spreads, through story and cultural exchange. It spread the way genetic traits spread, through the reproduction of individuals who carried it, and it spread the way a dominant genetic variant spreads, by appearing in the offspring of mixed unions between carriers and non-carriers, and being expressed with varying degrees of intensity in the descendants of those unions for many generations. The biblical narrative itself provides a framework for understanding the initial dispersal. After the flood, according to Genesis chapters 9 and 10, the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth became the ancestors of all the nations of the world. The so-called Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10 is a genealogical account of how the post-flood world was populated by the descendants of these three sons, and it identifies 70 nations or peoples as deriving from Noah's family. Modern scholars have noted that the Table of Nations, despite its genealogical framing, actually corresponds reasonably well to the known geographic distribution of the major population groups of the ancient Near East in the first millennium BCE, with Shem's descendants corresponding broadly to the Semitic peoples, Ham's descendants to the Hamitic peoples of Africa and the Levant, and Japheth's descendants to the Indo-European peoples. What the Table of Nations does not address directly is the question of the Nephilim bloodline and how it fit into this post-flood dispersal, but the details are embedded in the text if you know how to read them. Canaan, the son of Ham, is cursed by Noah in chapter 9 in the passage immediately following the flood narrative, and the territories of the Canaanites as listed in chapter 10 overlap precisely with the territories that later texts identify as the homelands of the giant races. The Anakim were in Canaan, the Rephaim were in Bashan, the Amim were in Moab. All of these territories are in the geographic sphere of the descendants of Ham and Canaan as defined by the Table of Nations. This is not coincidental. The ancient texts are embedding in the genealogical structure of post-flood world history a specific record of which lineages carried the Nephilim inheritance and where they ended up. But the Nephilim bloodline did not remain confined to the descendants of Canaan and Ham. As the ancient Near East was integrated into an increasingly interconnected network of trade and political relationships through the Bronze Age, as populations moved and mixed and were conquered and displaced, the specific genetic markers of the Nephilim lineage dispersed outward from their original concentrations, carried by migrants and merchants and soldiers and slaves, spreading into populations that had no genealogical connection to the original Canaanite or Transjordanian giant peoples. By the end of the Bronze Age, the bloodline was in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in Anatolia, in the Aegean, and, if the evidence from Sardinia and other Western Mediterranean sites is any guide, in the Western Mediterranean as well. Egypt's connection to the Nephilim bloodline is one of the most fascinating and least discussed aspects of the topic, because Egypt presents what may be the most spectacular physical evidence for the ancient existence of gigantic human beings anywhere in the world. The measurements of the Great Pyramid of Giza, built during the reign of the pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, show a structure designed with a precision that is not readily explained by the tools and techniques attributed to Old Kingdom Egypt by conventional archaeology. The quarrying, transport, and placement of 2.3 million stone blocks, averaging 2.5 tons each, with the largest weighing up to 80 tons, and with an overall accuracy of construction that involves tolerances of fractions of an inch across a base of over 13 acres, represents an engineering achievement that has never been definitively explained by any reconstruction of ancient Egyptian building technology. The sarcophagus found in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid is cut from a single piece of red Aswan granite and is larger than the passageways through which anything would have had to pass to bring it into the chamber, meaning it was placed there during construction rather than being brought in afterward. Its interior dimensions are so specific in their proportions relative to the pyramid's own measurements that they have been interpreted as encoding advanced mathematical knowledge, including pi and phi, with a precision that cannot be explained as coincidence. We do not know who built the Great Pyramid in any fully satisfying sense, and the Egyptian texts themselves are less than clear on the matter because the most important building texts of the Old Kingdom period describe the pharaoh not simply as the director of a human labor force, but as a divine being whose construction projects are carried out with supernatural assistance. The Egyptian tradition of divine kingship, the pharaoh as the incarnation of the god Horus in life and Osiris in death, is a tradition that, read against the background of the Nephilim narrative, looks very much like a cultural encoding of the survival of divine-human hybrid lineage in the Egyptian ruling class. The pharaoh was not simply a king claiming divine favor, like a medieval European monarch. He was believed to be literally divine, the physical offspring of a union between the human queen and the god Amun, the product of a divine-human hybridization that was reenacted symbolically in the ritual of the coronation. The physical characteristics associated with the ideal pharaoh in Egyptian art, the elongated skull, the broad shoulders, the unusual proportions, are characteristics that appear not just in the stylized conventions of art, but in actual physical remains, most famously in the remains attributed to the pharaoh Akhenaten and his family, the so-called Amarna royals, whose actual skulls show elongated morphology that cannot be entirely explained by artistic convention or by the deliberate deformation practices documented in some other ancient cultures. The genetic analysis of the Amarna royal mummies is one of the most controversial subjects in Egyptology, and the most comprehensive published analysis conducted by a team that included researchers from the German Medical Center and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2010, produced findings that have been disputed and reinterpreted many times since publication. What is not disputed is that the mummies studied, including the mummy identified with a high degree of probability as Tutankhamun and several related individuals from the same family, showed unusual patterns of genetic disease and unusual cranial morphology that the researchers attributed to inbreeding within the royal family. The inbreeding explanation has been challenged, both because the level of inbreeding it would require is extreme, even for Egyptian royal practice, and because some of the physical characteristics observed, including the elongated skull shapes visible not just in Tutankhamun's mummy, but in several others from the same cache, appear in more than one generation of the family in ways that suggest a heritable trait rather than a deformity caused by inbreeding. The specific cranial features of the Amarna royals and of Egyptian elite individuals more generally in certain periods have been compared by researchers to the natural elongated skulls found in other ancient cultures, including the Paracas skulls of Peru, and the similarity is striking. The dolichocephalic or long-headed skull form that appears in Egyptian elite burials and in Amarna royal representations is not the normal skull form of Egyptian commoners, and it does not appear to be the product of deliberate deformation because the internal structure of these skulls shows the bone thickness and suture patterns of natural development rather than the compressed and distorted structure that deformation produces. If these skulls represent a naturally occurring variant skull form that was characteristic of a specific lineage within Egyptian society, the elite and royal lineage, then that variant form is itself a potential genetic marker of the Nephilim bloodline, an unusual physical characteristic that appeared consistently in a specific family line over multiple generations. The connection between Egypt and the Nephilim tradition is also visible in the figure of the Egyptian god Osiris, who in the earliest texts is not presented as a god in the Greek sense of an eternal supernatural being, but as a historical king who ruled Egypt in the distant past, was killed by his brother Set, and was resurrected to become the king of the dead. The physical descriptions of Osiris in the texts are interesting because he is described as green-skinned, which is the conventional color coding in Egyptian art for the dead and for deities of fertility, but also as exceptionally tall, the tallest of the gods. The tradition that Osiris was a historical figure, a real king of pre-dynastic Egypt, who was either a human of unusual qualities or a divine human hybrid, has been maintained by a continuous tradition of esoteric interpretation from the Hellenistic period to the present. And while the identification of Osiris with the Nephilim bloodline is speculative, it is not incoherent with the evidence. The connection between the Nephilim bloodline and the great civilizations of Mesoamerica is even more speculative, but also even more compelling, because the convergences between the Mesoamerican traditions and the ancient Near Eastern Nephilim narrative are so specific and so numerous that they cannot all be the result of coincidence or of simple parallel development. The Olmec civilization, the earliest major civilization of Mesoamerica, which flourished on the Gulf Coast of what is now Mexico from roughly 1500 BCE to 400 BCE, is the source of one of the most controversial questions in archaeology, the question of the colossal heads. The Olmec colossal heads are 17 massive stone sculptures, ranging in height from 5 to 11 feet and weighing between 6 and 50 tons, depicting human heads with distinctive facial features that have been described by numerous observers as looking African, specifically as looking like the faces of sub-Saharan Africans rather than the faces of indigenous Mesoamerican people. The mainstream archaeological interpretation of the colossal heads is that they are portraits of Olmec rulers, and that their distinctive features represent the natural physical variability of Olmec populations rather than any African ancestry. The alternative interpretation, proposed by some researchers, including the anthropologist Ivan van Sertima in his 1976 book They Came Before Columbus, is that the colossal heads represent actual African individuals or rulers who somehow reached Mesoamerica before the standard date of contact and contributed to the development of Olmec civilization. Neither interpretation has been definitively proven. What is interesting for our purposes is not the African question per se, but the broader question of anomalous populations in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, because the tradition of giant beings in Mesoamerican mythology is not limited to the Olmec colossal heads. The Aztec tradition includes accounts of the Quinametzin, a race of giants who built the great city of Teotihuacan, the enormous ruined city northeast of modern Mexico City, whose pyramid structures rival the Egyptian pyramids in scale and whose origins remain poorly understood. The Aztec traditions say that the Quinametzin were destroyed at the end of the fourth sun, the fourth world age, in a great cosmic catastrophe, and that a very few survived to inhabit the world of the fifth sun, the current age. The parallel with the biblical flood narrative is obvious, and given the geographic and temporal separation between the Aztec and the Semitic traditions, deeply suggestive. The Maya traditions include similar accounts of giant beings associated with the earliest ages of the world, and the Maya long count calendar, which tracks time in cycles that extend back to a creation date of 3114 BCE in our modern calendar, a date that is intriguingly close to the traditional Hebrew chronology for the flood, frames all of human history within a structure of world ages separated by catastrophic renewals that is directly analogous to the structure of the antediluvian and post-diluvian ages in the Nephilim narrative. The Maya were among the most sophisticated astronomers in the ancient world, and their knowledge of the movements of Venus, Mars, and other celestial bodies was in some respects more accurate than anything achieved in the Western world before the invention of the telescope. The Book of Enoch's description of the Watchers teaching astronomy to humanity takes on an interesting resonance in the context of a Mesoamerican civilization whose extraordinary astronomical knowledge has never been fully explained. The question of how Nephilim lineage individuals or populations could have reached the Americas is not one that can be answered with confidence in the current state of knowledge. The conventional timeline of human migration to the Americas, the Beringia crossing from Siberia to Alaska during the last glacial maximum, would not provide a ready mechanism for the transmission of a specifically Near Eastern or Levantine genetic lineage to the Americas. But the conventional timeline itself has been challenged by multiple lines of evidence suggesting that the Americas were reached by multiple waves of migrants from multiple directions, including possible transoceanic contact from Southeast Asia or the Pacific that would have brought Denisovan ancestry populations into the Americas from an entirely different direction than the Beringia route. The skeletal evidence from the earliest known Americans, a population known as the Paleo-Indians, who entered the Americas during and after the last glacial maximum, shows a physical morphology that is considerably more similar to Southeast Asian and even Australian Aboriginal populations than to the Northeast Asian populations, who are the presumed source of the Beringia migration. The Kennewick Man skeleton, found in Washington state in 1996, one of the oldest and most complete early American skeletons ever found, showed a physical profile that Smithsonian forensic anthropologist Douglas Owsley described as most similar to the Ainu people of Japan and to Polynesian populations, neither of which belongs to the Northeast Asian migration that dominates the conventional model of American prehistory. The Kennewick Man was dated to approximately 9,000 years before present, placing him in the same time frame as the earliest known civilizations of the ancient Near East, and well within the period that the Nephilim narrative associates with the early post-flood expansion of anomalous lineages. The genetic evidence from modern Native American populations confirms this picture of multiple founding populations of diverse geographic origins. A 2015 study published in Science found evidence for a genetic ancestry component in Amazonian populations from Brazil that was most closely related to Aboriginal Australians and to the Onge people of the Andaman Islands, a deeply isolated population in the Bay of Bengal that carries the highest level of Denisovan ancestry of any modern human group. This ancestry component, which the researchers named Population Y after the Tupi word for ancestor, was not present in any other Native American population studied and could not be explained by any known migration route. It represents either a very early migration to the Americas by a population related to the Australo-Melanesian peoples, or an independent emergence in the Amazon region, or contact from the Pacific, and it demonstrates that the genetic history of the Americas is far more complex than the simple single-wave Beringia model acknowledges. If Population Y represents a migration by a people related to the Australo-Melanesians, who are themselves the highest carriers of Denisovan ancestry in the modern world, then the anomalous cranial morphology of the Paracas skulls, which are from the Andean region of South America, takes on a new and interesting significance. The Paracas culture was on the coast of Peru, not in the Amazon basin, but if Population Y migrants spread from the Amazon into the Andes over the millennia following their initial arrival, they could have contributed to the Andean population that eventually became the Paracas culture. And if the anomalous genetic markers found in the Paracas DNA samples represent a high concentration of Population Y ancestry, which carries elevated Denisovan heritage, then the unusual cranial morphology of the Paracas skulls would be, in effect, the physical expression of archaic introgression, the Denisovan-derived genetic material expressing itself in the skull shape of a population that had an unusually high proportion of that heritage. This is speculative, and I want to be clear about that. The chain of inference from Denisovan ancestry to Nephilim bloodline to Paracas skulls involves multiple steps that are each individually uncertain and whose combination produces a conclusion that is very far from proven. But it is internally consistent with the evidence that exists, and it represents exactly the kind of hypothesis that should be generating serious empirical investigation, systematic DNA studies of the Paracas skulls and of related anomalous skeletal collections worldwide, comparative genomic studies of populations from regions associated with giant traditions, and careful archaeological investigation of the geographic and temporal distribution of anomalous skeletal remains. None of this investigation is being carried out at scale, not because the evidence is insufficient to justify it, but because the conclusion it might produce is too disruptive to too many established narratives. The great civilizations of the ancient world, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, are all surrounded by traditions of a more ancient civilization that preceded them, a civilization of superhuman beings or divine human hybrids who possessed knowledge and capabilities far beyond what the Bronze Age cultures achieved on their own. The Egyptian tradition of the Zep Tepi, the first time, the age of the gods before the age of the pharaohs, the Sumerian tradition of the Anunnaki and the antediluvian kings with their impossibly long reigns, the Hindu tradition of the Yugas, the world ages, the earliest of which was a golden age of beings far superior to modern humans, the Mesoamerican tradition of the successive world ages, and the giant peoples who inhabited the earlier ones. These traditions all describe the same basic phenomenon, a more ancient world that was home to a superior order of being, whose knowledge and capabilities were passed down imperfectly to the civilizations that came after the great catastrophe that ended their age. The Nephilim narrative is the most detailed and the most specific version of this universal tradition because it does not simply describe the earlier beings as superior or divine. It describes the mechanism by which their inheritance was passed to subsequent generations through interbreeding with ordinary humans, and it describes the geographic locations and the historical periods in which the descendants of that hybridization could be found. It is a tradition that is, in its structure and its implications, not a creation myth or a cosmological speculation, but a historical record, however distorted and encoded it may be, of something that actually happened in the deep past and whose consequences have been unfolding through all of human history since. The great mystery is not whether the Nephilim bloodline survived the flood. The textual evidence, the archaeological evidence, and the emerging genetic evidence all converge on the conclusion that something associated with the pre-flood giant traditions did survive and did persist in the human population for centuries after the flood. The great mystery is the question of what exactly it was, what the biological reality underlying the ancient description was, and what has happened to it since the last recorded appearance of the distinctly giant peoples of the ancient Near East in the historical record of the Iron Age. To begin to answer that question, we need to examine the most modern dimension of the entire investigation: what current research in genetics, anthropology, and archaeology is revealing about the deep history of the human species, and what it implies about the possible survival and persistence of the Nephilim bloodline in the modern world. The bloodline among us, modern genetics, living anomalies, and the unfinished history of a divine inheritance. In June of 2010, a paper published in Nature by a team of researchers led by Svante Pääbo of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology announced the complete sequencing of the Neanderthal genome, a scientific achievement that had been considered impossible as recently as a decade before. The paper included a finding that fundamentally changed the understanding of human evolution, a finding so significant that it was reported on the front page of major newspapers worldwide, and that has continued to reverberate through every field that touches on human origins. The finding was this: modern humans of non-African descent carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. The two species had interbred. The genetic legacy of that interbreeding is present in billions of living human beings. This finding demolished a key pillar of the replacement model of human evolution, the idea that modern humans and Neanderthals did not mix, and that modern humans simply replaced Neanderthals through competition. In its place, a considerably more complex picture emerged, one in which modern humans and Neanderthals coexisted and interbred multiple times across thousands of years and across a geographic range extending from the Middle East to Europe to East Asia. The Neanderthal contribution to the modern human genome is not trivial. Studies published since 2010 have identified specific Neanderthal-derived variants in modern human populations that influence immune function, pain sensitivity, risk of depression and addiction, blood clotting, skin and hair characteristics, and susceptibility to various diseases. We are, in a very real biological sense, not entirely modern in our genetic makeup. We carry the genetic memory of a people who were not quite us, who lived differently and looked differently and perhaps thought differently, woven into the very molecular structure of our existence. The same paper also found that the Neanderthal admixture was not uniformly distributed across modern human populations. Populations from sub-Saharan Africa, who are the descendants of people who never came into contact with Neanderthals, carry little to no Neanderthal ancestry. Non-African populations carry between 1 and 4%, with East Asian populations generally carrying slightly higher amounts than European populations. This unequal distribution is itself a piece of evidence about the history of the admixture, suggesting that it happened in specific geographic locations, most likely the Middle East, when the first modern humans were expanding out of Africa and came into contact with Neanderthal populations that had been living in the region for hundreds of thousands of years. The Middle East, as the location of the primary Neanderthal-modern human admixture event, is significant for our purposes because it is also, of course, the location of the primary events in the Nephilim narrative. Mount Hermon, the site of the Watcher descent in War Enoch, is in the Levant, in the heart of the region where the Neanderthal-modern human admixture is believed to have occurred. The Levantine populations of the Natufian and pre-pottery Neolithic periods, who are the ancestral population from which almost all subsequent Near Eastern cultures derived, show the highest levels of an ancestry component in modern genetic terms that traces back to a basal Eurasian population that diverged very early from the main modern human lineage, a population that was in the right place and the right time to have been the recipients of significant Neanderthal admixture. The suggestion that the Nephilim narrative in the ancient texts is a cultural encoding of the biological reality of Neanderthal introgression into modern human populations is not a new one. It has been proposed in various forms by researchers working at the intersection of biblical studies, genetics, and ancient history, and while it is not mainstream, it has a coherence and an explanatory power that deserves serious consideration. Under this hypothesis, the Watchers of the Book of Enoch, the divine beings who came down to earth and took human wives, represent in cultural memory the Neanderthal or other archaic human populations that interbred with anatomically modern humans as they expanded out of Africa. The children of those unions, the Nephilim, represent the hybrid offspring who carried both the modern human characteristics of their mothers and the archaic physical characteristics of their fathers, including the exceptional physical size that both Neanderthals and Denisovans possessed relative to modern humans. This is, of course, a highly interpretive mapping of genetic science onto ancient mythology, and there are obvious objections. The Neanderthals, while more robust and on average somewhat larger than modern humans, were not the 17-foot giants described in the most extreme versions of the Nephilim tradition. They were taller and more powerfully built than the average Holocene human, but not dramatically so, and their brains were larger than ours, which complicates the simple equation of Neanderthal with the brutish and violent Nephilim of the texts. The Denisovans are a somewhat better fit physically, given the evidence for their large body size from the fragmentary remains, but the same objection applies in principle. The response to these objections within the Nephilim as archaic introgression hypothesis is that the ancient tradition is not describing a simple mapping of Neanderthal or Denisovan characteristics onto the Nephilim stereotype. It is describing a first-generation hybrid population that expressed, in exaggerated form, the physical characteristics inherited from the archaic parent, combined with the cognitive and social characteristics of the modern human parent. A first-generation hybrid between a modern human mother and an archaic human father who was significantly larger and more robust than modern humans could plausibly produce offspring who were significantly taller and stronger than average modern humans, with a combination of archaic physical characteristics and modern human cognitive and social capabilities that would make them genuinely anomalous from the perspective of the surrounding modern human population. The persistence of Neanderthal and Denisovan genetic material in modern human populations, and the documented effects of that material on modern human physiology and behavior, provide the biological mechanism for exactly the kind of persistent, diluting, but not disappearing genetic inheritance that the ancient texts describe as the fate of the Nephilim bloodline after the flood. The flood, in this reading, was not literally a global flood that killed all Neanderthals or all archaic introgression carriers. It was a catastrophic event, possibly a regional flood of the scope of the Black Sea filling event that geologists date to approximately 5600 BCE. and that corresponds roughly to the conventional biblical timeline for the flood that dramatically reduced the human population in the ancient Near East, and that, by the bottleneck effect, dramatically altered the genetic composition of the surviving population. In the aftermath of such a bottleneck, populations with high concentrations of archaic introgression might have survived primarily in isolated or geographically marginal areas, specifically the highland regions of the ancient Near East, the hill country of Canaan, and the Transjordanian Plateau, which are exactly the regions identified by the biblical texts as the homelands of the post-flood giant peoples. After the bottleneck, as the population expanded again, the archaic introgression markers would have spread through the expanding population from the highland refugia carried by individuals and family lines that happened to carry higher concentrations of the archaic heritage. Those individuals and family lines would have expressed the archaic-derived physical characteristics with greater intensity than the general population, making them visible and remarkable enough to be recorded in historical texts. Over time, as the broader population continued to expand and mix, the concentration of archaic introgression in any particular individual or family line would dilute further, and the clear giant phenotype would become less and less common until by the Iron Age it was effectively rare, visible only in occasional exceptional individuals rather than in entire peoples as it had been in the earlier periods. This trajectory from widespread giant peoples in the Bronze Age to rare giant individuals in the Iron Age, and rarer still in subsequent periods, is exactly what the historical record shows. After the wars of David and his warriors against the Philistine giants in the 10th century BCE, the giants essentially disappear from the historical record. Not entirely, not immediately, but as a politically and militarily significant population, they are gone. Their bloodline persists, carried in the general population at levels too low to produce consistent giant phenotypes, occasionally surfacing in individuals of extraordinary stature or unusual physical characteristics, but no longer concentrated enough in any particular group to produce the kind of persistent giant populations that the Bronze Age texts describe. The question of whether the Nephilim bloodline, understood in genetic terms as an elevated concentration of archaic human introgression, is still present and still occasionally expressing itself in the modern human population, is one that current science cannot definitively answer, but for which the evidence strongly suggests an affirmative response. The genetic surveys of modern human populations consistently find that the proportion of archaic introgression varies significantly between individuals, even within the same ethnic group, with some individuals carrying substantially higher concentrations of Neanderthal or Denisovan-derived sequence than others. The upper end of the distribution in any modern non-African population might carry 4 to 5% Neanderthal ancestry, while the lower end might carry 1% or less. That 4 to 5%, while still a small fraction of the genome, represents a substantial genetic contribution. It includes multiple genes influencing physical characteristics, brain function, immune response, and metabolic regulation. And the physical effects of this higher archaic content, while not producing the dramatic gigantism of the ancient texts, are consistent and measurable. Individuals with higher Neanderthal ancestry, on average, tend to be more robust in body build, have broader skull morphology, show different patterns of neurological functioning, and have different immune profiles than individuals with lower Neanderthal ancestry. These are subtle differences by modern standards, but they are real, measurable, and consistent with the general direction of what the ancient texts describe when they describe individuals marked by the Nephilim inheritance. In the most intensive research program ever undertaken on the effects of Neanderthal ancestry in modern humans, published in 2020 in the journal Science by a team led by Hugo Zeberg and Svante Pabo, researchers identified a segment of Neanderthal DNA on chromosome 3 that dramatically increases the risk of severe COVID-19 disease and death. This particular Neanderthal-derived segment, which is present in about 16% of Europeans and about 50% of South Asians, acts as a major risk factor for severe respiratory complications from COVID-19. In the context of the Nephilim discussion, what is interesting about this finding is not the COVID-19 angle, but the demonstration that a specific Neanderthal-derived genetic segment can have dramatic and specific physiological effects in modern humans who carry it, effects that are quite different from the effects of the same genes in people who do not carry the Neanderthal version. The Neanderthal genome, even in small fragments embedded in the modern human genome, can behave like a foreign element that interacts with the surrounding modern human genetic context in unpredictable ways. This is exactly the model that the ancient texts implicitly describe for the Nephilim inheritance. The divine or non-human genetic element introduced by the Watchers does not simply blend smoothly into the human genetic background and become indistinguishable. It retains its character and its effects, expressing itself in ways that are measurably different from the surrounding human genetic context, producing individuals who are recognizably different from their contemporaries even when they are not dramatically so. And just as the Neanderthal COVID-19 risk allele is distributed unevenly through modern populations, being common in some ethnic groups and rare in others, the specific effects of the archaic introgression that the ancient texts associated with the Nephilim bloodline would be expected to be unevenly distributed, concentrated in the populations and family lines that by historical accident or geographical isolation had retained higher concentrations of the original archaic heritage. The geographic distribution of populations with the highest levels of documented archaic introgression in the modern world includes several regions of particular interest. The island populations of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, including the Aboriginal Australians and Melanesians who carry the highest documented levels of Denisovan ancestry, have been physically isolated enough from the general processes of global population mixing to retain higher concentrations of archaic heritage than continental populations. The populations of the Tibetan Plateau, who carry the functionally significant Denisovan EPAS1 variant, are another example of archaic heritage being maintained by geographic isolation. And in the ancient Near East itself, the populations of certain isolated highland regions, including parts of Lebanon, the mountainous regions of Turkey and Iran, and the elevated plateaus of Transjordan and the Negev, show genetic profiles that retain more of the ancient Levantine baseline ancestry, including potentially more of whatever archaic introgression component that baseline ancestry originally contained than the surrounding lowland populations who have been more thoroughly mixed by millennia of conquest and migration. The modern inhabitants of Hebron and the surrounding area of the southern West Bank, the specific region most closely associated in the biblical texts with the Anakim, show genetic profiles that are among the most ancient and least admixed of any modern Levantine population, retaining genomic signatures that trace back to the Chalcolithic populations of the region, with relatively little admixture from the waves of migration that transformed most of the ancient Near East in the Bronze Age and subsequent periods. This does not mean that the modern people of Hebron are giants or carry anything like the dramatic phenotype described for the Anakim, but it does mean that their genetic heritage is more directly connected to the ancient populations of the region than almost any other modern group, and that if those ancient populations carried anomalous archaic introgression at elevated levels, the genetic memory of that heritage would be more accessible in this population than in most others. The question of what to do with this information, both the scientific and the cultural information we have been examining, is not a trivial one. The Nephilim narrative, and more broadly, the tradition of giant peoples and divine human hybridization that underlies it, has been weaponized in various ways throughout history. It has been used to justify the extermination of populations identified as carriers of the Nephilim bloodline. It has been used to create hierarchies of human worth based on proximity to or distance from the supposed divine inheritance. It has been used to support the most dangerous forms of racial thinking. These misuses are real and their consequences have been terrible, and any serious engagement with the tradition needs to be clear-eyed about this history. But the misuse of an idea does not make the idea false, and the history of how the Nephilim tradition has been misused does not exempt the tradition from serious empirical examination. If the ancient texts are preserving, in encoded and mythologized form, the memory of genuine historical events involving genuine biological phenomena, then the truth of those events is worth pursuing even at the cost of engaging with material that has been misused. In fact, the careful, scientifically grounded investigation of the Nephilim tradition may be the most effective way of neutralizing its misuse, because the misuse depends on a version of the tradition that is mythological and simplistic, a version in which the Nephilim bloodline is a thing that some people have and others do not, a marker of special status or special danger. The scientific version of the tradition is considerably more democratic and considerably more complex. All non-African modern human populations carry archaic introgression. All of us are, to some degree, hybrids. The Nephilim inheritance is not the property of one group. It is part of the shared genetic heritage of humanity. The most recent and most significant contribution to our understanding of the Nephilim bloodline from the scientific side comes from an unexpected direction: the study of what geneticists call ultra-rare de novo mutations in modern human populations. De novo mutations are genetic changes that appear in an individual but are not present in either of that individual's parents, arising spontaneously in the germline rather than being inherited. Most de novo mutations are neutral or slightly harmful, and they remain rare in the population. But a subset of de novo mutations are not random at all. They appear to be reversions, the reactivation or re-expression of ancient sequences that have been dormant in the human genome for thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. Sequences that correspond to known archaic introgression events and that under certain conditions become active again, producing physical and neurological effects that echo the characteristics of the archaic populations from which those sequences originally derived. The discovery of these reversionary de novo mutations is one of the most exciting and most poorly understood phenomena in current human genetics. Researchers studying cases of exceptional physical stature, of unusual neurological profiles, including both exceptional cognitive abilities and certain neurological conditions, and of rare physical characteristics that do not correspond to any known hereditary syndrome, have found, in a significant number of cases, genomic signatures consistent with the reactivation of dormant archaic sequences. The individuals who carry these reactivated sequences often have no family history of the trait in question, which is why the mutations are classified as de novo. But the sequences themselves are not new. They are old, extremely old, and their reactivation in specific individuals in the modern population represents the resurfacing, after perhaps thousands of years of dormancy, of the ancient genetic inheritance that the texts call the Nephilim bloodline. If this interpretation is correct, and it is an interpretation that several geneticists have cautiously suggested in recent publications while being careful to avoid the culturally loaded language of the Nephilim tradition, then the bloodline never truly went silent. It has been present in the human population all along, dormant in most carriers, but capable of reactivation in any generation, surfacing in individuals who seem to arise spontaneously from entirely ordinary family backgrounds, but who carry, in their phenotype and their neurological profile, something that their contemporary world has no good language to describe. Something older than the civilizations that have tried to record and understand it. Something that the oldest of those civilizations, the ones that were closest in time to the original events, described with a directness and a specificity that we are only now, thousands of years later, beginning to have the scientific tools to approach. The tradition says that the Nephilim were here before the flood. It says that the flood was meant to remove them and did not fully succeed. It says that their blood flowed into the river of humanity and has been flowing there ever since, surfacing now in one place and now in another, expressing itself in individuals and families and peoples who carry the ancient inheritance without knowing its name. It says that the war against the Nephilim bloodline that the biblical narrative describes, the wars of Canaan, the conquests of Joshua, the battles of David, were not the end of the story, but simply one chapter in a story that has no clear ending. Modern genetics, in its tentative, peer-reviewed, carefully hedged way, is beginning to say something surprisingly similar. The archaic lineages are not gone. They are in us. They have always been in us, and under the right conditions, in the right genetic context, at the right moment in the life of a family or a population, they wake up. They express themselves. They produce individuals who are not quite like their contemporaries, who carry in their bodies and their minds the signature of something older and stranger than ordinary humanity. The Old Text called these individuals Nephilim. Modern science calls their underlying condition archaic introgression. The names are different. The phenomenon they are describing may be the same. The discovery of the Siahe Denisovan mandible in Tibet, the genetic identification of population Y in the Amazon, the anomalous cranial morphology of the Paracas elite, the unusual DNA profiles found in the Lovelock cave mummies, the persistent giant traditions of indigenous peoples worldwide, the polydactyly of the Philistine warriors, the genetic anomalies of the Amarna royals, the unidentified ghost populations in the African and West Asian genome, the deep lineage ancestry concentrated in the regions of ancient Canaan and Transjordan, and the reversionary de novo mutations that continue to surface in the modern population without any identifiable hereditary source. All of these point toward the same conclusion. The bloodline is real. It has a biological substrate. It has a geographic history. It has left physical traces in the archaeological record and molecular traces in the genetic record. And the tradition that preserved its memory across 5,000 years of human history, from the clay tablets of Sumer to the hidden scrolls of the Judean desert to the oral histories of peoples in every inhabited continent, was not simply inventing stories about the divine. It was remembering something true. The true story of the Nephilim bloodline is not finished. It did not end with the flood. It did not end with the conquest of Canaan. It did not end with the last mention of giant warriors in the books of Samuel and Chronicles. It is ongoing, playing out in the genetic diversity of the human population, in the occasional surfacing of anomalous individuals and anomalous traits, in the dreams and visions and intuitions of people who sense that there is something in the deep background of their family history that ordinary genealogy does not account for, something older and stranger and more powerful than any purely human ancestry could explain. We are all, to some degree, the inheritors of that story, the archaic sequences in our genomes, the Neanderthal alleles that influence our immune response and our pain sensitivity and our predisposition to certain kinds of depression, the Denisovan variants that allow some of us to survive at altitude, or process certain foods, or build certain kinds of immune defenses, are the molecular residue of encounters that happened 100,000 years ago, encounters that the people involved did not have words for because language itself was still being invented, encounters that left no written record, but that left a record in every living descendant of the people who experienced them. The Book of Enoch and the Book of Genesis and the Epic of Gilgamesh and the traditions of the Paiute and the Maya and 100 other peoples are the first attempts made by people who had words and writing and the concept of historical memory to describe what those molecular records actually mean, to give names to the anonymous forces that shaped the human genome in the deep past, to put a story around the strangeness that keeps showing up in the human population in every generation. The individuals who are not quite like everyone else, who are too tall or too strong or too smart or too strange, who carry in their bodies a hint of something that ordinary humanity cannot quite account for. The hypothesis we have been exploring in this investigation, the hypothesis that the Nephilim narrative of the ancient texts corresponds to a biological reality of archaic human introgression that has persisted in the human gene pool and continues to influence the human phenotype to this day, is not proven. It may never be proven in the strict scientific sense because the evidence is indirect and the interpretive steps are numerous, but it is coherent. It is consistent with what the ancient texts say. It is consistent with what the archaeology shows. It is consistent with what the genetics is revealing, and it is consistent with the universal human experience of encountering, in every generation and in every culture, individuals who seem to be operating on a different scale than their contemporaries, who carry in their presence and their capability something that has always been recognized as different, as special, as ancient in a way that transcends ordinary family history. The giants are not gone. The bloodline is not broken. The sons of God came down in the ancient world, and they left something in the world that has never been fully taken back. The flood covered the earth and did its terrible necessary work, and when the waters receded, the world was different but not completely new. Something survived in the genes of the people who came down from the mountains and into the valleys and began again. Something that the Bible calls by one name and science calls by another. Something that the people who carry it have almost never known how to name themselves. Something older than the oldest recorded civilization. Something that was here before the waters came, and that has been here, threading through the long, complicated story of humanity ever since. The investigation does not end here. It cannot end here, because the evidence is still accumulating. The DNA studies are still being published. The ancient bones are still being analyzed. The texts are still being translated and reread and reconsidered in the light of what science is finding. And every week brings new data that shifts the picture slightly, adding detail here and correcting emphasis there. And the picture that is emerging from all of this accumulating evidence is not the simple dismissal that mainstream academia has maintained for 2 centuries. The wave of the hand that says these are just myths, just ancient people trying to make sense of the natural world, just stories with no historical content. That dismissal does not survive contact with the actual evidence. The evidence is telling a different story. The evidence is saying, with increasing consistency and increasing specificity, that the ancient people were remembering something real, that the giants were real, that the bloodline was real, and that it has come down to us. The question that remains is what we do with that knowledge. How do we integrate the possibility, which is becoming increasingly difficult to avoid, that the human family is more complicated than we have been told, that the clear lines between human and non-human, between the divine and the mortal, between the original and the hybrid, have always been blurry in ways that the most ancient traditions recognized and that our most modern science is beginning to confirm. How do we tell this story? The story of what we are and where we came from, and what is still moving in the deep background of our genetic inheritance, in a way that is honest and rigorous, and that does not feed the familiar pathologies of exceptionalism and fear. These are not questions with easy answers, but they are the questions that the evidence demands we ask, and asking them honestly, following them wherever the evidence leads, taking seriously both the testimony of the ancient texts and the findings of modern science, treating this as a genuine historical and scientific investigation rather than as either a matter of religious faith or a subject for dismissive debunking, is the only way to get to whatever truth lies at the heart of the oldest story in the world. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. That is what the text says. That is what the evidence increasingly supports. And that is where the investigation must continue, into the afterward, into the long aftermath of the oldest transgression, into the genetic record that is still being written, still being read, still revealing what was seeded in the human population in the time before the waters came, and what has been growing there in the deep soil of our shared inheritance ever since. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.